Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice. Wow, Adam, I read your book. It's thankfully thin. A lot of books I get are like 800 pages long, and it takes me forever. So I really enjoyed it a lot. But before we get into all that, you know, I knew your father back in the 90s.
You do, Jonathan.
Jonathan, yes. He did a couple talks for us at Caltech. We had a distinguished lecture series at Caltech. And because he wrote on the Bible, and what was the name of his? The Harlot on the Side of the Road?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
And basically the theme is, can you believe that's in the Bible?
Right, exactly. No, it's a family tradition.
Yeah. And then he did a book on Moses, I think a biography of Moses, right?
That's right.
I remember kind of the take-home message for me was there probably was no Moses, or if there was, he didn't lead a 30 years in the desert, a group of people and all that stuff. There's no archaeological evidence for that. But the story, it's a story. It's like a literary truth. You know, it's like an important novel that has deeper mythical themes about human nature and society and so on. Why isn't that good enough? Why does it have to be true in an archaeological sense, something like that?
Yeah.
So that was interesting. Yeah. And he worked at, if I recall, he worked at the LA Times. I think he edited me when I did some op-eds there, but I may be.
Could be. He was at the LA Times. He practices law. That's his main occupation, but he also has written for the LA Times and lots of other places. Right.
Yeah. All right, Adam, how do you go from writing poetry and reviews for all these wonderful publications to writing about settler colonialism? What triggered that?
It seems like a bit of a stretch, but the truth is that I read a lot about different kinds of books, including ideas and history and politics and religion. And this is a sort of idea, settler colonialism, that I had been familiar with and seen sort of gaining prominence in the academic world. And then after the Hamas attack last October, it sort of burst into public view in a new way. There was a lot of talk about settler colonialism and Israel as a settler colonial state. And it made me think that it would be useful to sort of drill down on what this idea means to people, what they mean when they say that, and how it affects the way they think, not just about Israel, because the book is also a lot about the history of the United States and how settler colonialism changes the way we think about America.
Yeah, for sure. I think here's the first explanation I've heard that completes the explanation for the anti-Semitism on college campuses since October 7th. I've been asking everybody on my show that has anything to do with this, what is going on? These are liberals, and liberals always supported Jews and Israel, and now it's like the opposite. And I've not heard a complete explanation until I read your book. It is this ideology that Israel is a settler colonialist state, whatever that is. We'll get into that in a second. So that explains it. I mean, if you really believe that a group of people are the indigenous owners of a land and somebody comes in and kicks them out, then it's understandable that they would be morally outraged about that.
Right. I mean, I think the equation goes, if the Jews in Israel are settlers and colonizers from Europe, and the Arabs are the indigenous people of Palestine, then resistance against any kind of Jewish occupation is justified up to the point of killing civilians, because those are people who in some sense don't deserve to be there. They shouldn't be there. They're not in the right place. And that is a lot of what drives the idea of settler colonialism, is that Europeans have gone around the world, taken land from indigenous peoples, and that they don't really have any right to be in the places that they are. The concept really began talking about countries like Australia and Canada and the United States that were founded by British colonists a long time ago. And it's come to be applied to Israel because that is a sort of live settler colonial situation where these issues are still being fought out in a way that they're not in the United States, for example.
What about the argument that this is kind of a Marxist idea of one group is an oppressor and another group is the oppressed? Jews are disproportionately successful politically, financially, scientifically, artistically, and so on. They must have gotten that success by oppressing somebody else, so therefore they are the enemy or something like that.
Well, I see what you're getting at, and there is, I think, some of that. It's not really what I'm talking about in this book, where I'm focused more on
Yeah.
the idea of how the state of Israel was created and what the situation sort of on the ground is there now. And in that situation, it's definitely true that Israel has power over Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, but in Gaza currently is fighting a war in which many people have died. So it's true that in that conflict, Israel is the more powerful side and enjoys the support of the United States government and other Western governments in the way that Palestinians don't. And I think that a lot of the indignation and anger on campuses comes from a very honest place of people are being killed in large numbers. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed in this war, and we want that to stop. That this is an injustice. We want it to stop. I think that is totally understandable. And in fact, one of the things I say about this ideology of settler colonialism is that, like other radical ideologies, it starts with the idea of being indignant about an injustice, and that's a praiseworthy feeling. The question is, what do you do with that feeling? How does it create an analysis of what happened in the past and what needs to be done in the future? And that's where I think things go wrong, as they have with other radical political ideologies in the past.
Yeah, we're going to get into all that in just a second. I'm just kind of exploring some of these deeper themes that could also be going on, like just traditional old anti-Semitism. I mean, it's always been Jews as the target of bigotry and hatred and genocide and so on. So I do wonder if there's some of that still as an undercurrent in some of these protests, or if that's not really it at all. It's this other thing that you're talking about.
Well, I think it is an undercurrent sometimes, and for some people. I mean, I think that in general, campus protesters would adamantly say we are not anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
But there's a sort of natural slide from we're not anti-Semitic, but we're anti-Zionist, and therefore we oppose Jews who support Zionism, and that's almost all Jews. So that, in effect, has the same consequence as anti-Semitism, which is opposing Jews and feeling like Jews are a bad influence, or are responsible for evils in the world. It's also true that anti-Semitism, although it often gets mentioned on the same list with things like racism or homophobia, is not really the same kind of prejudice. It's not a kind of racial prejudice about looking down on people who are different. It's more like a conspiracy theory about, as you say, why certain people are disproportionately successful or powerful or wealthy. And in this situation, I think a lot of people who see what's going on in Israel and Palestine can easily sort of slide into those ways of thinking without really acknowledging that that's what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned the outrage over Europeans going into these foreign lands and taking over the place, colonizing the people. Well, that's true, right? This is what happened in Australia and New Zealand and in America and so on. What's wrong with being outraged by that?
Well, it is true. And one of the interesting things about the idea of settler colonialism is that, in a way, it doesn't say anything that everyone in these countries doesn't already know, right? Everyone just in America, everyone learns in elementary school that this country was founded on land conquered from Native Americans, and that's sort of the history of our country, and it's all over the map in place names, and it's not something that is hidden. What's different about this new way of thinking about the past is that it says that settlement is not something that took place hundreds of years ago and is part of the past. It's an ongoing event. It's one of the phrases that's often quoted is from an Australian writer named Patrick Wolfe, who sort of kicked off a lot of this theorizing in the 1990s. And he said, apropos of Australia, invasion is a structure, not an event. And what that means is that everything about a settler colonial society continues to be all about colonialism, even hundreds of years after the settlement takes place. And in that way, it sort of turns it from a historical issue into a current political cause or a critical theory about why society is wrong in various ways. And so settler colonialism can be blamed for all different kinds of inequality or injustice or prejudice in the present, not just in the past.
Yeah. All right. So there's colonialism, and do you distinguish that from settler colonialism and then settler ideology?
It's a complicated sort of set of labels and terms. I think the key to what's going on now, people did talk about settler colonialism earlier, especially after World War II, when the British and French were giving up their colonies or being forced out of them violently. There was a decolonization movement, and that was something that, in fact, the U.S. supported, in which the British and French were driven out of territory they had occupied in Africa and Asia. And of course, the United States itself was founded as an anti-colonial movement, right? It was about throwing the British out of America. But in those contexts, when people talked about settler colonialism and settlers, they were talking about Europeans who had settled in these colonies and in places like Algeria or Rhodesia, where Europeans made up a small percentage of the population, but sort of dominated and exploited a much larger native population. So in Algeria, we had maybe 10% Europeans and 90% Arabs and Berbers. Or in Rhodesia, you had maybe 8% white English colonists, and the rest were native Africans. And in those contexts, when you talk about settler colonialism, it's clear what the political goal is. It's to expel or expropriate the white settlers. And that's something that could be imagined and, in fact, ended up happening through violent struggle. But starting in the 90s, this idea started to be taken over by theorists in Western countries who started to apply it to places like Australia and America, where there is no possibility of decolonization, right? There's no actual possibility that everyone in the United States who's descended from a non-native background will leave, because it's almost everyone and there's no place for them to go. So it's not a comparable situation in that sense. But when you start to look at the history of the United States or the present of the United States through the lens of settler colonialism, what that means is that the country is sort of irreparably guilty of being founded through sin, through an original sin of colonialism, and that everything about the country is tainted by that. And that doesn't necessarily lead to decolonization, but it does lead to a very critical and adverse view of the United States, which has political consequences. And that's what I'm writing about in the book.
Yeah. So decolonizing politically seems clear and obvious enough. You just return the government back to the people that should be running it instead of the colonialists. But what does it mean to decolonize, I don't know, my organization, decolonize my bookcase?
Right,
all these other, what are they talking about there?
So when that term gets used in the American context, it's not about what you might think decolonization is, which is, taking over a colony and making it an independent country. It's more about mindsets and attitudes and political convictions and even sort of spiritual ideas. One thing I say in the book is that a lot of this has the same sort of shape and mood of looking at yourself for sin, scrutinizing yourself for sin. What are my ideas or my attitudes that are colonialist? How can I get rid of them? In a way that people also say about racism, sort of what am I doing, maybe even unconsciously, that's colonialist that I have to atone for or repair. And so one of the more popular versions of this is to decolonize your bookshelf, which means read books by non-white authors. But more broadly, it can come to mean almost anything that feels like it's about making yourself a better person or about making the world a better place is in some sense anti-colonial. It's some kind of decolonization. And that can take different forms. Often it has to do with environmentalism, for example. There's a big idea in this sort of world of theory is that exploitation of the environment is a settler colonialist thing to do, and the native peoples in the Americas didn't exploit the environment, and that we have to sort of go back to that earlier native or indigenous model, which is not really a realistic political program, but it's a sort of a way of saying what's happening in America right now is wrong. The civilization that we've built here is wrong. It's unworthy. It needs to be reformed or abolished.
Right. Here's your quote from Patrick Wolf again. The colonizers came to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. So 2024 United States is still a colonizer.
Exactly. And one of the things that can be sort of confusing about the term settler colonialism is that it uses words that in other contexts mean different things in a sort of particular way. In Israel, when people talk about settlers, they're talking about Jewish Israelis who are living on occupied territory in the West Bank, right? Territory that Israel conquered in 1967, but isn't part of Israel proper. Those people are called settlers, and there's a lot of political controversy about them because they're living on land that isn't legally part of Israel and might one day be returned to as part of a Palestinian state. But the idea of settler colonialism says that all Israelis are settlers. Everyone, whether they're inside or outside the official boundary, is a settler because the land does not belong to Jews, and Jews shouldn't be living there, or certainly not controlling it. And so when a number of people after last October's Hamas attack celebrated it and said, this is resistance to settler colonialism, they were sort of carrying that to its logical conclusion, which is these people shouldn't be here, therefore we're going to kill them in order to try to drive them out. And in America, when we talk about the colonial period, we're talking about before the American Revolution, right, when the 13 colonies were under British control. But in the language of settler colonialism, America is itself a colonial country and always will be because it was created by people who are not indigenous to North America. So when people talk about fighting colonialism, they're talking about the existing United States.
Why isn't Gandhi a hero to these people? He was a decolonizer. He is like the champion of this, but his approach was nonviolent.
Well, I think that a lot of people would admire Gandhi. A lot of these people would admire Gandhi as an anti-colonial leader. But the situation in Israel, I think, has more in common, not with the sort of Indian struggle against the British, but with the Algerian struggle against the French in the 1950s and 60s. And the difference is that there were not a large number of British settlers in India. British people didn't go to India to stay in the way, like in the quote you just read, the invaders came to stay. That's not really what happened in India. In India, the British came to exploit, to make money, to take advantage of commerce and bring the wealth back to Britain. But they didn't come to take over land and make a new country as they did in North America or in Australia. In Israel, people did settle to stay. And the question is, if can they be evicted? Because that is what happened in Algeria. In Algeria, about 1 million French and also other European people went to Algeria to live permanently. It was part of France for 150 years or about, and was actually legally part of France. It had no different status than any other part of France. It was like another state of the United States, comparable to that in France. And so people, in order to drive those European settlers out, the Algerian independence movement was extremely violent, used extremely violent tactics. And that is sort of similar to what the PLO and Hamas have done in Israel. And another point of similarity is that a lot of that violence, maybe even the majority of it, wasn't directed against the colonizers, but against other native people in order to enforce the rule of that movement. So in Algeria, the FLN, the Front for National Liberation, killed lots and lots of Algerian Arabs and Berbers in order to prevent anyone from compromising with France, for example, and to show that they were going to fight to the end. And Hamas in the Gaza Strip is sort of uses similar means. It rules by terror and violence, not just against Israelis, but also against other Palestinians.
And so is this one reason why we still don't have a two-state solution? As I understand it, there have been many offers for this, and the Palestinians have turned it down because they don't think there should be a two states. There should just be one state and no Israel for these reasons you're talking about here. Yeah,
I mean, I think that is the root of the problem. Exactly who's responsible for there not being a two-state solution is something that each side has its own story about, and even within each side, different people tell different stories about it. There was some progress in the 1990s when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, famously shook hands on the White House lawn and signed a peace accord. And the idea was that was supposed to start the process of creating a Palestinian state, and that never happened. And there's a lot of debate and recrimination about why that didn't happen. Was it because the Palestinians wanted more than the Israelis could give, or was it because the Israelis didn't want to give as much as the Palestinians needed? But fundamentally, on the level of sort of theory and ideas, which is really what I'm writing about in the book more than the politics and history, the idea of settler colonialism says a Jewish state in Palestine is a foreign colony. It can never be a legitimate state. It can only be taken over by white Europeans in land that doesn't belong to them. And one of the things that I'm trying to argue in the book is that model of settler colonialism doesn't fit the reality of what's going on in Israel and Palestine. One reason why it doesn't is that there's no mother country, right? You're not saying send French colonists back to France or send British colonists back to Britain. There's people who live in Israel came from lots of different places, Jews from lots of different countries, and they have no mother country that sent them there, conquered the land for them, or where they could go back to. They are essentially a native people because they have no mother country other than Israel. And if Israel were to be destroyed, they wouldn't have any place else to go. And one thing that I say in the book is that what that means is that the kind of terrorist tactics that might have worked against the French or the British can't work against Israel because their only choice is to fight back.
Okay, on the ideology front and academies, which is difficult to understand, here is Wolf, Patrick Wolf, he's Australian, I think you mentioned, in his seminal 2006 paper, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native. So explain to us what this means. Logic that initially informed frontier killing transmutes into different modalities, discourses, and institutional formations as it undergirds the historical development and complexification of settler society. Whoa.
Yeah, that's a very academic way of putting it. But essentially what it's saying is it's the same idea as invasion being a structure, not an event. It's saying you might think that the invasion of Australia by the British or of North America by British colonists is something that happened centuries ago and is over and done with. But in fact, it's part of a process that continues today in no longer by physical violence, but by things like laws, ideas, customs, language, the way that people talk and think about natives and settlers. And that in some sense, those things are equally criminal and equally wrong. So one of the other people that I discuss in the book says that things like national parks or mining can be thought of as forms of genocide because they rely on taking land, on land that's been taken from native peoples. So when most of us, when we hear the term genocide, think of killing large numbers of human beings. But within this discourse, having the dispossession of native peoples is a kind of genocide. And so everything that flows from it is also a genocide. So if you establish a national park on land that once belonged to an Indian tribe, that's genocide. And it's a kind of way of making everything, pushing everything to the most extreme political and moral point of view of saying everything that an illegitimate regime does is genocidal and has to be resisted.
You're killing a culture, essentially.
Exactly. That even if you're not killing human beings, you're killing a culture, or even if you're not killing culture, you're sustaining the repression of a culture. And what I argue in the book is that way of looking at politics is really a recipe for constant, eternal conflict. It means that we're constantly refighting battles of the past and are unable to move forward into a future that could be better for everyone.
Okay, here's you. If the definition of a progressive movement is that it believes the future can be better than the past, then the ideology of settler colonialism is not progressive because it believes the past was better than the future. It is impossible to turn the clock back to the world that existed before 1788 or 1607 or 1492. Yeah, it seems to me this is not a far-left, progressive, woke, liberal movement at all.
Yeah, it's a strange sort of combination of things because most people who talk about settler colonialism would call themselves progressive. But if you think about what does progressive mean, it's supposed to mean progress. It's supposed to mean we're going to change society in ways that make the future better. But at the heart of this idea is that everything that exists is sort of wrong and illegitimate compared to what existed hundreds of years ago. So really what you want to do is turn the clock back or undo history rather than putting history in a new direction. And that does really make this a different kind of progressive politics. And I think it helps to explain why it sometimes takes forms that are so surprising, like sympathizing with a movement like Hamas, which is really a religious fundamentalist terrorist movement, right? It's not the kind of thing that you might expect Western progressives to sympathize with or want to ally themselves with. But if the idea is that we're trying to end the status quo and go back to the way things were before Jews started to settle in Israel, which was in the 1880s in modern times, then anyone who serves that goal is in some sense on our side, even if everything that they actually do and believe is very anti-progressive. So it creates strange alliances.
So the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and gay rights and Native American rights and all that stuff, these are just Band-Aids over a much deeper problem, and this is not going to do what you white people think it's going to do. And maybe you're not racist at heart, but you've embraced this deeper settler colonialism, so you're still at fault.
Yes, and one of the things I get into in the book, which is pretty interesting, is that settler colonialism sort of explicitly distances itself from the civil rights movement, for example, by saying the sort of classic civil rights movement idea was that America had made promises about liberty and equality that it had not kept for all of its citizens, right? It had not kept them for Black Americans. And that was what Martin Luther King talked about in the famous I Have a Dream speech. He said, the Declaration of Independence was a promissory note that hasn't been paid, and we're here to make that payment, to claim that payment at last after so many years. And one way to think about social change in America is to say, this is a country that was founded on these noble ideals that hasn't lived up to them, and we want to make them, put them into practice for everyone. But if you look at America as a settler colonial country, then that way of thinking can't really hold because the very foundation of the country was wrong. It's not that the country started out right and didn't live up to its ideals. It's that it shouldn't have been created in the first place. And so there are certain writers who I talk about in the book, both popular and academic, who will say explicitly this is not about civil rights, and you can't think about Native Americans in the same way that you do about other, say, ethnic minorities in the United States, because it's not about making room for everyone. It's about getting rid of the country that was created here against the will of the people who really own the land.
Yeah. All right, Adam, I'm here in Santa Barbara. This is Chumash country. The
Yes.
Native Americans were here first, then the Spanish came. We have a huge mission down here, one of the largest Spanish missions. And I live up in the top of the mountains up here above Santa Barbara, and I actually have some petroglyphs on my property. I mean, these little Native American drawings are beautiful. And so clearly my house is sitting on somebody else's land. But, you know, this is centuries ago, and I bought the house from the person that built it. He bought it from somebody who bought it, and all the way back to the 50s when the house was built. And I don't know when that road was carved up there, maybe in the 40s or something. I mean, how far back do you go to who actually owns land, and what am I supposed to do about it?
Right, exactly. I mean, I think what I'm sort of arguing, or what it comes down to in the end, is it's of course true that all of these violent and warlike acts were created, and that America was created through war and conquest. That's absolutely true. It's also true of every other country on the face of the earth. Every country was created through displacement or through conquest, through conflict, and people were killed to establish it. And it's not possible or even desirable to sort of undo the past, to say we're going to go back to the moment when it all went wrong and remedy it and make that as if it never happened. Because that would mean inflicting new injustices on the people, as you say, who didn't do anything wrong personally, who are inheritors of this situation but didn't cause it. And I think that that's true in the American context. It's also true in the Israeli context. The idea that people who were born in Israel or whose parents were born in Israel don't really belong there, or that they're settlers even though they were born there and deserve to be driven out, that is not an idea that leads towards peace and a better future. It's an idea that leads towards permanent conflict. And so what I come to in the end of the book is to say there has to be a way of looking at the future that's better for everyone rather than fighting battles from the past sort of permanently. One thing that takes different forms in different places. I mean, there's no real prospect of American states or the federal government turning over land to native tribes. And in fact, even if that could happen, it wouldn't restore the way of life or the country that existed here before 1492. That was a very long time ago, and everything, technology, science, society, has changed since then. So it's a bit of an illusion or a myth to say that it's possible to undo settler colonialism. What we can do is try to act justly towards everyone who lives in the land and attempt to create peace and security for everyone rather than fighting one side against another.
Sure. And I can understand that if there are vast differences, say, in personal wealth, income, access to jobs, and so on, then those should be remedied to whatever the extent the government can do that, even all the way up to a UBI, universal basic income, or reparations even. I'm not personally in favor of that, but I could see an argument being made. But they're not even making that argument, right? They're not making the argument that the United States government owes reparations to the Native Americans, for example.
It's not, when people theorize about settler colonialism, it's very rarely is it about actual policy steps. And one of the things that I say in the book is that when Native American organizations talk about the things they want, they don't use the language of settler colonialism. They talk about, as you say, concrete things, land rights, enforcing laws, enforcing treaty obligations. Settler colonialism is more of a way of thinking about the world, and the effects of it can be very indirect from the original cause. So what it really does is it sort of creates an idea that the existing Western American civilization is sort of tainted by an original sin, and is inherently illegitimate. And that has all kinds of implications for issues that are very far from Native American rights. It means that almost anything that a person objects to about capitalism or about the environment or inequality or patriarchy or homophobia, any of these issues can be cast in terms of this is because of settler colonialism. And it can be applied in ways that from the outside seem very arbitrary, but within this world of thought make a lot of sense because settler colonialism is sort of where it all began to go wrong. And I give some examples of that in the book. The question is, is the right way to address social injustices to say that they're a result of settler colonialism, or does that only seem to make resolving them impossible or impossibly abstract?
Right. Like on the other side of the hill here, there's a casino, the Chumash Casino. It's a big moneymaker for the Native Americans. Okay. But I'm guessing the settler colonialist theorists would say that's a joke. That's nothing. That's just a toss off by the government to cover up their sins, something like that.
I think that's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, I'm sympathetic to some of this. If you read Native American history, which I've done a fair amount of, it's pretty disturbing to read what the United States government did to the Native Americans over the centuries, particularly when you read it from our moral perspective in the 21st century. It's pretty bad. I mean,
Sure.
I think, wow, okay, but now what? So what do we do?
Right. And I think that's really the problem, is that there's a great deal of injustice everyone knows about in the history of America towards Native Americans, towards African Americans. And the question is, how do we sort of make a future that's better than the past? And settler colonialism is a backward-facing vision. It's saying these things that seem to have taken place a long time ago are actually taking place now, and we're all responsible for them now. And I think that is not factually true, and it doesn't result in any better future for anyone, which is one reason why I think, one has to take indignation against injustice, which is where it all begins, and think about better ways to formulate it and apply it.
Yeah. Can you give us a brief history of colonialism in the first place? How far back does it go? Whose idea was this? Is this an outgrowth of capitalism because we need new markets and raw materials and so forth? Or what do you know about it?
Well, it's a big subject, obviously, but the idea of sort of taking over land and settling it goes back as far back as you can go in history. You see it in ancient times everywhere, and up through modern times. But Greece and Rome were great colonizers. They were conquering land and settling new cities. And the key thing is that until probably the 20th century, that was seen by the people who did it as a very good thing to do. It was about spreading one's country and one's civilization. Most people who engaged in it would have thought of it as bringing a superior civilization where there was none. And certainly that was true of the Europeans who colonized North America and South America. When people talk about European colonialism, they're really talking about the process that began with the discovery of the New World in 1492, where very quickly different European countries started to take over, to conquer land from existing empires, the Inca or the Maya, and then later in North America. And then at a still later point in the 19th century, really began to conquer land in Africa and Asia, less to settle it and more to exploit it, to exploit the people living there. And that European colonialism rested on the idea that Europeans are sort of superior, their civilization is superior, their religious faith is superior, and that by spreading it around the world, they were doing the right thing. They were spreading light. Very few people, there were always some critics, internal European critics of colonialism, who pointed out the violence and the injustice that this involved. But the sort of dominant narrative was Europeans have the right and even the obligation to go everywhere that they want and take all the land that they want. And that really only began to change after World War II, or in the 20th century after World War II. And a large part of the reason why it changed is simply that countries like Britain and France no longer had the resources to administer these empires. They had been so damaged and impoverished by 2 world wars that they couldn't sustain their empires anymore. And what we've seen in the last, in the 20th century, in terms of colonialism, is similar to what we saw with many other areas of life, having to do with, for example, with the status of women or with racism. Things that in the 19th century and before, people in power sort of took for granted that they were superior and that they had the right to dominate over others, that idea is being challenged. And of course, that is a huge step forward for humanity, for justice. And the question of settler colonialism is really an outgrowth of that process. It's saying, now that we are reassessing our past and saying that things that people were once proud of, we're now ashamed of, what should our attitude towards the past be? In that sense, it's a part of the same debate as the debate about American history, about how we should think about the founding fathers, for example, or how we should think about Western civilization itself. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Is it something that should be celebrated or something that should be criticized? This is one facet of that larger movement.
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing for us today to look back and say, can you believe what these people said they believed? I mean, about blacks or Jews or women or Native Americans or whatever. But it's another thing to say they should have known what we know, and they should have known that what they were doing was bad. That seems incorrect. It's kind of presentism. And is that part of settler colonialism? They kind of feel like they should have known better and they did it anyway.
Well, it's a tough one because, as I said, there have always been some people who knew what was going on was wrong. Just as even in the earliest days of American slavery, there were people, Quakers, for example, who said this is wrong. But most people weren't able or willing to say that. And one reason why is that it's very hard to get people to take moral stands against their own material interest. And so you could say that one reason why people are able to reassess American history after the fact is that after the continent has been conquered and after sort of the American civilization has overwhelmed what was here before, then it's easier to turn around and say, we've done something wrong. We've done injustice to the people who lived here before. That's actually a running theme in American literature, starting in the early 1800s, is that after Indians have been displaced from a region, then writers come and say, or become nostalgic for the people that are no longer there. You can see that in James Fenimore Cooper, who famously wrote about the last of the Mohicans, right, and sort of romanticized it. And after the war is over, you can romanticize the people who had been your enemies up until recently. So it is a challenging sort of moral task to say, how do we think about our history in ways that are honest and don't conceal injustice, but also don't make it the only thing that we see in the past or the most important thing about our country? Because I think that is also a form of unfairness. It's to say it washes out a lot of other truths that we also need to keep in mind about America.
Yeah, let me read you something here I wrote in 1997 when we were covering the history wars that are along these lines, so that this is not actually that new. This is my essay called The Beautiful People Myth, Why the Grass is Always Greener in the Other Century. Long, long ago, in a century far, far away, there lived beautiful people coexisting with nature in balanced eco-harmony, taking only what they needed and giving back to Mother Earth what was left. Women and men lived in egalitarian accord, and there were no wars and few conflicts. The people were happy, living long and prosperous lives. Men were handsome and muscular, well coordinated in their hunting expeditions as they successfully brought home the main meals for the family. The tan, bare-breasted women carrying a child in one arm and picked nuts and berries to supplement the hunt. Children frolicked in nearby stream, dreaming of the day when they too would grow up to fulfill their destiny as beautiful people. But then came the evil empire, European white males, carrying the disease of imperialism, industrialism, capitalism, scientism, and the other isms brought about by human greed, carelessness, and short-term thinking. The environment became exploited, the rivers soiled, the air polluted, and the beautiful people were driven from their land, forced to become slaves, or simply killed. This tragedy, however, can be reversed if we just go back to living off the land where everyone would grow just enough for themselves and use only enough to survive. We would then all love one another as well as our caretaker Mother Earth, just as they did long, long ago in a century far, far away.
Yes, I mean, I think that's essentially the story that is told today, 25 years later. It's essentially the same story.
Yeah,
and in fact, as I talk about in the book, Europeans started to tell that story almost immediately after discovering the New World. The book Utopia, which invented the word utopia in 1516, so just about 25 years after Columbus, was about a mythic Native American island where everything was perfect and there was no greed and there was no sort of disharmony. And then as now, that was really a way of criticizing European civilization. In the same way, settler colonialism is often a way of criticizing American civilization rather than looking at the history of what was really happening in America before 1492.
Yeah, I quoted from William Cronin's Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England. It is tempting to believe that when the Europeans arrived in the New World, they confronted virgin land, the forest primeval, a wilderness which had existed for eons, uninfluenced by human hands. Nothing could be further from the truth. Indians had lived on the continent for thousands of years and had to a significant extent modified its environment to their purposes. The choice is not between two landscapes, one with and one without a human influence. It's between two human groups, two human ways of living, two ways of belonging to an ecosystem. All human groups consciously change their environment to some extent. One might even argue that this, in combination with language, is the crucial trait distinguishing people from other animals. And the best measure of a culture's ecological stability may well be how successfully its environmental changes maintain its ability to reproduce itself. In other words, Native Americans were changing the land long before Columbus came here.
Right. And in fact, there are people who go back even further to tens of thousands of years and point to massive changes in animal populations or in landscapes in North America and elsewhere too. Because as soon as human beings arrive in a place, they begin to hunt or they begin to burn forests for wood. And there's no way to inhabit a land without changing it. A good book on this is 1491 by Charles Mann.
Yeah, that's a great book. Yeah, because I also cited the 1996 book War Before Civilization, The Myth of the Peaceful Savage by University of Illinois anthropologist Lawrence Keeley. So he has the data at the time of all these archaeological digs showing how many of the skeletons indicated violent death. You know, right. arrow points in their bones and bones broken a certain way, cannibalism, and so on, all by Native Americans against each other.
Right. And one of the sort of things that some Native American historians don't like about the idea of settler colonialism is that it sort of flattens out all of these actual experiences into this narrative of an all-powerful European presence sort of committing genocide against a helpless Native American people. And in fact, if this was the process of sort of American taking over North America took centuries, hundreds of years, and at different times and places, the power imbalances were very different. One of the things I write about in the book is to try to understand why, for example, when the Puritans settled in New England, they felt that the natives who they encountered were much more powerful than they were and wanted to wipe them out. And so they had to wipe out the natives first before they were wiped out. So it wasn't simply we're going to sort of destroy an unworthy civilization and take over. In most places where there was actual conflict, it had more to do with mutual fear and hostility of both sides saying, if we don't fight the other side, they're going to come kill us. And unfortunately, that's what most conflicts, human conflicts, are like and are caused by, including the one in the Middle East. You could say that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really both sides feel that they can't afford to stop fighting. Both sides feel that if they stop fighting, they'll be destroyed. And the question is there a way out of that impasse, right? It's very difficult to get out of that impasse. Conflicts can be frozen in that form for generations and centuries. And I think that settler colonialism, as we saw after last October, doesn't help to resolve that conflict. If anything, it makes it worse.
Yeah. Let's just think about what constitutes legal ownership of land. That's a fairly new concept. I mean, I have a house, I have a mortgage company, the title company guarantees that I actually own it. Somebody shows up and said, "This is my house." I could go, "No, here's the contract. Take it up with the title company," something like that. But that's fairly new. If you go back centuries, it was just like I put my stake. Here's my flag. We own this land, and you have to defend it with an army or police or whatever. And if we go back 10,000 years, I mean, there's just people just moved around. They migrated all over the globe. And if you kick out all the animals that are there and there's other people that are there, or some people come in and kick you out, that's the history of humanity.
I think that's true. And it is one of the reasons why this is such a sort of complicated subject to situate yourself in, because as far back as you go in any civilization, you're going to find war and conflict and dispossession. And so in a sense, all of us have inherited that. All of us who live in a certain place, at one time there was someone else living in that place, virtually everywhere in the world. And historically, when a country conquered another country or conquered territory and sent out colonists to it, they thought they had done a great and glorious thing. If we no longer think that, it's difficult to find another way to think about the past that isn't equally simple-minded and simply says we are evil and need to atone and repent for things that happened, 400 years ago. One of the interesting things about this language of settler colonialism is that for this, a settler isn't someone who actually settles a piece of land, and it's not even the descendants of that person. It's everyone who's not descended from an indigenous person. So one of the sort of complications of this is that people will say, descendants of Black slaves are settlers because they occupy a place in this settler colonial society and they're not indigenous, they're not native, so they are also settlers. Or people who think of who might be an oppressed minority in one situation, like Latinos in the American Southwest. If you go back another few centuries, they themselves were the settler colonialists, and therefore they're also settlers. So it's a very polarizing way of looking at the past, which ends up putting almost everyone on the quote unquote wrong side.
Yeah. Again, where I live here, it used to belong to Mexico. If you
Exactly.
don't want to go all the way back to the Native Americans, we just took it.
Right. Mexico is a good example. Southwest United States was conquered by the U.S. from Mexico, and Mexico was conquered from native peoples living there by the Spanish. So you'd have to go back a very long way to get rid of them.
Right. So what do settler colonialists say about where to draw the line? I mean, Romans were all the way up in England and France and Germany, what we call those countries now. But if somebody came forward and said, "We want France back, it belongs to Italy," it's like, no, that's crazy. We're drawing the line much later than that. Okay, where?
Right. No, the question of where to draw the line is a big one. And as in the United States or in Canada or in Australia, you could say that the process of settlement was so complete and successful that it's no longer really a live issue, because in all of those countries, the native population is maybe 2 or 3% of the population. And in America, North America, settlement began more than 400 years ago. So there's no real political will to decolonize in any concrete sense. And that's why settler colonialism is more about theory, and it's about criticism. You can think of it as a critical theory of America, saying everything that's wrong about America can be traced to settler colonialism and the sort of moral and spiritual and political problems that it caused. In Israel, things are different because Israel was founded only 75 years ago, and it was not founded by replacing one people, but in fact, it's about two peoples living in the same very small territory that are at odds with each other. As I say in the book, today, in this territory, which is about the size of the state of New Jersey, there are about 7 million Jews and 7 million Arabs. So it's a 50-50 split. And currently the Israelis have the upper hand in most of that territory because it's either part of Israel or it's occupied by Israel, or it's an enclave that's sort of surrounded by Israel. But for a long-term solution, there has to be a way for both of those peoples to find a way to live in that land, rather than saying, it's ours, it's historically ours, and you're an interloper, you can't be here. There has to be some way for both peoples to live there.
Right. So 2,000 years ago for the Romans, or 500 years ago for Europeans coming to the Americas. Yeah, that's a long time ago. 1948, that's not so long ago.
Right. It's living memory. Exactly.
Yeah. Before we kind of wrap up with more on Israel, I want to read this section from your book about science, which is what we do here. So this is from Raff. What is her first name? Raff, R-A-F-F. Jennifer Raff, in her book Origin. What is it? A genetic history of America, or something like that. Indigenous people have been treated with disrespect, condescension, and outright brutality by a number of scientists. And she talks about Kennewick Man, the 9,000-year-old skeleton discovered in Washington State, which was fascinating because it really didn't have the features of Native Americans. It was like a different migration, maybe even from Japan, if I recall correctly. Anyway, the skeleton was interred as part of this repatriation movement, which we've also covered here at Skeptic. Scientists getting frustrated that, well, this is our data, these skeletons. We want to understand, the actual migration patterns using all the data we can. And a lot of the Native American groups are saying, well, this is our creation story. And there's a bunch of different ones. So you quote her saying, I'm a scientist, and this book is about the past from a scientific perspective. Seen from that perspective, DNA and paleontological evidence make it clear that the earliest human beings to inhabit the Americas came from East Asia, perhaps as long ago as 25,000 years ago. Raff acknowledges that this account, quote, conflicts with the understanding of some, though certainly not all, tribes of their own origins. They know that they have always existed in their lands. They did not travel from somewhere else, close quote from her. Yet she declines to say that, in this case, science is correct and myth is not, writing only, quote, I acknowledge this conflict, but will not attempt to resolve it if it is possible or necessary to resolve it at all, close quote. Well, come on. I mean, if you're a scientist, you want to know what actually is true.
Right.
I find that really frustrating.
Right. I mean, you can see where she's coming from. She doesn't want to be another one of these scientists who's being disrespectful and sort of running roughshod over another people's traditions. At the same time, as I go on to say in the book, no one would ever say that about, for example, Christian or Jewish origin stories, right? No one would say, I believe that, I'm not going to say whether the Garden of Eden really existed, because I'm a scientist and I tell one story and that's the Jewish and Christian story, and it's not my place to dispute it. The reason, sort of the emergence of science, was precisely by disputing things like that, saying we're going to think about things rationally rather than accepting inherited myths and beliefs. And so you get to a point where if you think that Western sort of civilization and its presence in other parts of the world is evil, then scientific thinking is one of those evils. And there's a real distrust of science and scientific thinking, and a preference for sort of more organic, mythic ways of thinking that are supposed to have pre-existed science. And it really does, at certain points, pass over into a kind of mysticism, which is as objectionable in one place and time as it should be in another.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like when the creationists were moving to get their doctrines taught in public school science classes, that scientists stood up and said, that's not science. You can teach it in a history of mythology class or something like that. And so that's where the conflict lies, I think. Yeah, there was that controversy maybe a year or two ago about the indigenous ways of knowing in Australia, or maybe it was New Zealand. Okay, fine, is a mythology or whatever history, but in a science class?
Yeah, no, the idea that there are ways of knowing or ways of being that are characteristic of indigenous peoples and like all indigenous peoples in different parts of the world versus settler ways of being and thinking, I think is really central to this whole concept. And it's one of the most objectionable parts of it.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay. So what do we do? The Israel thing is still looming large. It's in the news every day. We're recording this right after they discovered those 6 killed hostages. It seems obvious the two-state solution is the only way to go at this point. Seems to me 75 years is long enough. And in any case, river to the sea, where are you going to send 7 million Jews? Where are they going to go? I mean, this is not going to happen. So what are these people thinking?
Well, yeah, it's true. I mean, it's one of those conflicts where everyone can look at it and say the only sort of morally acceptable solution here is two states, but neither of the participants in the conflict want that. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians want that or are able to make the political choices and compromises necessary for that to happen. And so the conflict goes on and on. It's been going on my entire life. It's very possible that however long I live, it'll still be going on afterwards. And it's a very difficult thing to know, what is my responsibility as someone who's not personally involved in the conflict, but feels a deep interest in it as a Jew. What is sort of my responsibility? And I think that at a minimum, what I am hoping to do with this book is to say our responsibility as people who are thinking about this or observing it is to offer humane solutions and not inhumane ones. And that's sort of if anything, the simple but ultimate conclusion that I come to in the book.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that for a lot of people, these are sacred values. Land is a sacred thing to a lot of people in the sense that it's not like buying a business or selling your business. So if the United States president went over there and just took the checkbook out and said, all right, we're going to just write a huge check here. We send checks out for trillions of dollars. We do this all the time. What's your number?
Right.
Well, neither side is going to put a number on it because it's an insult to put a number on a sacred value.
Yeah, no, a lot of it does have to do with religion. But in fact, that's exactly what the U.S. did in 1979 to create peace between Israel and Egypt, right? Was to promise both sides huge foreign aid in order to sign this peace treaty, which returned the Sinai Desert to Egypt. And to this day, I think America sends $3 billion a year to Egypt in foreign aid. But at a certain point, that was a much easier thing to resolve because the Sinai wasn't inhabited mostly. It was very sparsely inhabited, and it wasn't the sort of ancestral homeland of the people. And when people are talking about their ancestral homelands, it's very hard to make concessions or to say we would rather live in peace than to die fighting for these lands that are were promised to our ancestors or that we've lived in since time immemorial. And at this point, I think it's unlikely that either side is ready or able to make that sort of decision, and things have only gotten worse over the last year.
But the deeper problem, again, back to my title company example, if your title company is God, and he gave me the land, and each side says the same thing.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult enough conflict, but then once you bring religious claims into it, it becomes insoluble.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to ask you about the telescopes up on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. They built the original telescopes were built like back in the late 80s, early 90s. Was there no objection then to that?
I don't know. It's a good question. Maybe they were built and that's what caused the objection, was that they were built without consultation. And then when it came time to build new ones, they said, well, we don't want to go through this again. But the truth is, I don't know the whole history of it. But I do talk about this one particular telescope called the 30-meter telescope that was proposed and planned for Mauna Kea and ended up not being built due to the objection of Native peoples. And that, is one thing and understandable in a lot of ways because, wherever something is built, often the people who live there don't want it built there. But what I talk about in the book is how settler colonial theorists have gone beyond that to say that, science is a kind of colonial conspiracy against Native ways of knowing. And that this is a symbol of that. And that, I think, is a much more objectionable step.
Yeah, clearly, because I've been up there. This is not land where anybody would ever live. It's 15,000 feet. It's freezing cold. I mean, if it was being built down on some nice, warm, plush farmland or something that you were displacing people, okay.
Right. It's about it being a sacred site.
Yeah, symbolic. Yeah, that's right. All right, Adam, I know you don't have the answer because nobody does how to deal with this issue, but you've certainly laid out the terms of the debate beautifully. It's a great book, On Settler Colonialism. There it is. Here we go.
Well, thank you very much for having me on and for this discussion.